Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
I'm going to tell you that since we have finished the first 6 chapters of Daniel, we have got past the really boring stuff. We're going to begin to get into what's really interesting now. And I want to start with a reminder that we are in the midst of the preparatory part of our series on the book of the Revelation. In other words, we're laying the groundwork so that we can undertake a really in-depth study of Revelation, the revelation that was given through the Apostle John, Yochanan. So, as such, we're going to finish the book of Daniel. We're going to do the book of Zechariah and the Olivet Discourses found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then we'll get into the study of the Revelation. I've got about 90 lessons already laid out. And really, I want to remind everybody that the reason for laying this groundwork is if we didn't do it, we really wouldn't be prepared to tackle Revelation in the depth that we should go into Revelation in, because everything in Revelation starts someplace out in the Old Testament, and in many cases it starts in multiple places in the Old Testament. So tonight we're going to start the 7th chapter of Daniel. Our goal is to get through verse 12 tonight. In the last 2 weeks we did 3 chapters. Tonight we're going to try to get the first half of chapter 7 done. This, to me, is an extremely important chapter, so we need to look at a couple of things before we start. Let's begin with the fact that Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 was interpreted by Daniel. Did everybody pick up their copy of one of these back there off that? All right, because we're going to use them tonight. This chapter 2, what Nebuchadnezzar was given in chapter 2, is really repeated in this chapter 7, but the information given here in chapter 7 is really far, far more extensive. And I think also the essential principle that God rules over the Gentile empires is further demonstrated as we go through this chapter in a very forceful and very revealing manner. Now, chapters 1 through 6 emphasize the fact that even the Gentile empires all over the world, irregardless of what you may think of them or they look like to you, are ruled by God. He sets them up, he takes them down. God has that complete sovereign authority. And whatever happens with these empires is within the scope of his authority, his sovereign authority. Chapters 1 through 6 revealed events in a very chronological order. That was their purpose. Lay out the chronology of everything. Take us from the beginning of Daniel being pulled out of Israel and taken to Babylon. Take it all the way through into the Medo-Persian Empire. Beginning with Daniel's chapter 1 is the exile. Started about 606 BC. Daniel was a very young man at that time, probably not more than 16 or 17 years of age. By the time we reached chapter 6, after the fall of the Babylonian Empire in 539, Daniel was an elderly man, probably between the ages of 83 and 85. These 6 chapters give a prophecy of things yet to come, particularly through chapter 2. And these first 6 chapters also give us insights as to what to look for, or at least things that we ought to keep in mind as we're moving forward, because we're going to see things that will be triggered by these events. Don't want any events in our future to be overlooked, because a lot of these will add up to that. We're going to show you one in particular this evening. There's a lot of important insights given in these 6 chapters, so that, and I hope that we noted these, by knowing what happened back there, we might start to recognize or become aware of things that are happening now that just aren't by chance. There's already a type and foreshadow. There's a picture of the event. This chapter 7 also introduces the Messiah. Introduces the Messiah in verses 13 and 14. And also, what is different here is that Daniel now becomes the receiver of the visions, with an accompanying angel as the interpreter to give Daniel understanding about these visions that he's being given. Note that these visions are directly from God to Daniel. Also, the focus shifts from the foreign setting in Babylon in those first 6 chapters to the fate of Jerusalem and the community that's living there as part of this chapter we're starting. So this focus is carried on through the remaining chapters, 7 through 12. And this chapter 7 is still in Aramaic. Remember, we switched to Aramaic early on in this so that all people would be able to read it and understand what was being written down. Beginning in chapter 8, which will begin in 2 weeks, the language will go back to Hebrew for the rest of the Daniel. Now, conservative biblical authorities consider chapter 7 to provide one of the most comprehensive prophecies of future events to be found anywhere in Tanakh, anywhere in the Old Testament. This is the most comprehensive layer of prophecies in all of the Old Testament. Daniel traces the course of 4 great world empires: Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Greeks, and then that 4th empire that begins with Rome. I want to emphasize that begins with Rome, because there's a theology floating out there that says that the Roman Empire is going to be reborn. I think that's pretty well gone away over the last 30 years, but that was very prominent when I was a kid growing up. That 4th empire begins with Rome and goes to the conclusion of world history, which culminates actually with the return of our second coming of Yeshua Messiah and the inauguration of the eternal kingdom of God, which is represented in this chapter as a 5th kingdom. As a 5th kingdom. So this chapter then forms a major outline of future events. Additional details are given in some of the other books that we're going to study, Zechariah and the Olivet Discourses. Plus, there are more details laid out for us in Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, but particularly when we get to the book of the Revelation. The importance of such an outline is to provide a basis. I'm harping on some things. Provide a basis from which all other prophetic events can be related. We can relate all other prophetic events to this information. So here in chapter 7, we have listed the order of the times of the Gentiles from the late 6th century BCE through the coming Messiah to rule the world sometime yet still in our future. So let's start with Daniel 7, verses 1 through 3, please. It says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babel, Daniel had a dream and visions in his head as he was lying on his bed. He wrote the dream down, and this is his account. I had a vision at night. I saw there before me the four winds of the sky breaking out over the great sea, and four huge animals came up out of the sea, each different from the others. In the first year of the reign of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had this dream. What it tells us. And it tells us that this year would have been around 553 BC. Babylon would have still been in existence. The dream would have occurred probably between the 4th and 5th chapters of Daniel that we've just been looking at in the chronology of the events. It is excerpted, though, this chapter. What's going on here is excerpted from that chronology and given to us here separately. That's to give it emphasis. That's to give it emphasis. That was a familiar device in the ancient writings to set an episode out by itself to give it emphasis, make it stand alone, make it be signature. And this is the first time, as far as the book of Daniel is concerned, that a vision is given directly to Daniel. Prior to this, they'd all been given and he had interpreted them. This vision is, in one sense, a summary of what was revealed before in the vision of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. But it's more. It's more. In the first 6 chapters, generalities as far as world history are concerned are revealed. In these last 6 chapters, starting with this one now that we're beginning, specifics are given to us about these revelations. The details of the end of the times of the Gentiles and the relationship of Israel to world history, with special reference to the time of the tribulation. It's going to be laid out for us over the next couple of years. Even though the vision given to Daniel in this chapter and the vision given to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 both seemingly cover the same subject, I'm harping again, there is, in fact, a sharp contrast between the two visions. We always, when we're speaking of these, have to emphasize that. A wicked and heathen king is used as a vehicle of divine revelation in chapter 2. And there's pictured world history as an imposing vision in the form of a statue. You guys are holding a sheet of paper. I hope you all picked one up as you came in, of that statue, of that man that's holding this. And the vision in this chapter 7, though, is not given by an unsaintly man. It's given through a child of God. Daniel was a child of God. Daniel was a man of God and a prophet of God. And this vision depicts world history as a succession of horrible beasts or horrible animals, depending upon your translation. Stern uses animals instead of beasts in most places. The last of which of these horrible beasts is really beyond description. It's something that we're almost going to have to be there and experience what it's all about to understand it. In chapter 2, Daniel's the interpreter. In this chapter, an angel interprets. Nebuchadnezzar's dream construes history from man's viewpoint, a glorious and imposing spectacle, even though it terrified him. We have to realize that the dream that God gave Nebuchadnezzar was in the only way that he could understand it. He was a carnal man. Nebuchadnezzar was a carnal man. He certainly couldn't understand it through any other sense than that. It's also interesting that God gave a man of God to interpret the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel, not an angel. So why do you think that might be? Why wouldn't God give Nebuchadnezzar an angel to interpret the dream as well? And it's one of those questions that I ask so I could answer. Do we think it might be that the king Nebuchadnezzar might have possibly worshipped the angel that gave him the interpretation instead of God. I mean, he had multiple gods that spoke to him in his own mind. So anyhow, Hashem brought a man of God, one of his own children, into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar to interpret the dreams. In chapter 7, Daniel's dream sees world history from God's viewpoint. Not the viewpoint of a man, what a man might construe it to be, but from God's viewpoint. He sees its immorality, he sees its brutality, he sees its depravity, and the details of the prophecy of Daniel here far exceed the one of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Far exceed the one of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Here in verse 2, Daniel states, I beheld, or I saw, or I was looking, and he saw 4 winds churning up the great sea. Now, symbolically, the great sea most likely represents the mass of humanity in the world, or the nations of the world, the goyim, everybody. The churning up or breaking would be the commotions amongst the nations of the world. One thing I believe that we need to see here, wind is uniformly used to represent the vast sovereign powers of God. Wind in Scripture is very often used uniformly to represent the vast sovereign powers of our God. Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, the wind, the breeze. And we need to understand that wind, uniformly used to represent the vast sovereign power of God, is the theme of what we're looking at. The vast sovereign power of God. The winds of heaven represent the heavenly powers or forces by which God sets the nations of the world in motion. We see these winds being the sovereign power of God, sometimes striving with men. Now, then let's consider that the number 4 is used here. There are 4 beasts. This may have symbolic meaning, representing people from all 4 corners of the world. All the people and all the nations being represented here. The sea involves the nations of the earth, and out of this, all humanity comes in these form of these 4 empires. The sea representing the nations, and the beasts representing the 4 world empires that come from this. Daniel chapter 7, please, verse 4. The first was like a lion. This is the first of those empires that God is showing. The first was like a lion. It had eagle's wings. As I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted off the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a human heart was given to it. This ties Babylon the empire to Nebuchadnezzar the emperor. A very short, very concise definition or explanation. The first beast was a lion with eagle's wings. It was a representation of Babylon, which was still in existence at that time. In this vision of Daniel 7, this beast, the lion, corresponds to the golden head of the statue in Daniel. Head of gold, lion, both corresponding to Babylon. Winged lions were a national symbol of Babylon. Sculptures of winged lions stood at the entrances to the Babylonian royal palaces. But the lion lost its wings and stood like a man. See, this is now bringing a reference to Nebuchadnezzar as a lion and as an eagle. I want to take you to several places outside of Daniel. First, let's look at Jeremiah 50:17. Israel is a stray lamb driven away by lions. First to devour him was Asher's king, and the last to break his bones is this Nebuchadnezzar king of Babel, Babel being Babylon. Now take this to Ezekiel 17, verse 3. Say that Adonai Elohim says this: a big eagle having wings and long pinions full of vari-colored feathers came to Lebanon and took over the top of the cedar. Understand that Nebuchadnezzar led Babylon into Lebanon before he led it into Israel. He and the Father before him. Ezekiel 17:7. There was another big eagle with great wings and many feathers, and the vine I believe being Israel, bent its roots toward him and put forth its branches toward him, so that he might water it more than in the bed where it was planted. In other words, Israel was in revolt against God at the time that Nebuchadnezzar was coming and taking over. And so they didn't want to stay where God had planted them. They wanted to be where they wanted to be. They wanted to replant themselves, if you will. Take that down now to verse 12, still in Ezekiel 17. Say to the rebellious house, that would be Israel, don't you know what these things mean? Tell them, here the king of Babel came to Jerusalem, took its king and princes, and brought them to himself in Babel, in Babylon. This would be Nebuchadnezzar. The lion is the king of beasts, and the eagle is the king of the birds of the air. And they're being used in reference to Nebuchadnezzar being the king of Babylon. It's interesting that in Daniel 2:37, where Daniel is interpreting the dream there, he refers to Nebuchadnezzar as King of Kings. Well, that sort of fits into what we've just looked at. Here in Daniel 7:4, though, Daniel watches as the wings are plucked, and the lion is made to stand on its feet as a man would, with a man's heart given to it. This is change. The change is also interpreted as a symbolic representation as to the time of Nebuchadnezzar's illness in chapter 4. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar was humbled by God, and he was humbled by God before he could come into the realization that even though he had been construed as King of Kings, he was only a man. He was only a man. Spend a little time with that if you want some homework and see how that kind of works out. We're going to get back to it later as we will refer back to this particular set of verses again. His lion-like character, Nebuchadnezzar's lion-like character, that is, his royal power, was given to him at God's pleasure. He had that only because God had allowed it. The symbolism is accurate. It corresponds to historical facts, everything that we've looked at about Nebuchadnezzar and all of this. Also implied in this symbolism of the lion and the bird and everything is the decline of Babylon and the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. See, the lion was made to stand on its feet and given like a human being. After Nebuchadnezzar had been humbled by God with his mental illness, he and his kingdom stopped conquering and became more humane in its treatment of his subjects. See, he was no longer the lion with wings charging about. It was a lion that had lost his wings and been given a human heart, stopped conquering and became more humane in its treatment of its subjects. This less aggressive stance, then, allowed for the rise of a strong neighbor, the Medes and the Persians. Strong neighbors, I guess that should be plural. And this would be Adonai, God's plan, being worked out. Daniel 7, verse 5. Then there was another animal, a second one, like a bear. It raised itself up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth. Between its teeth it was told, get up and gorge yourself with flesh. The second beast symbolizes this Medo-Persian Empire. The critics of Daniel for some time really had argued. There's been a lot of criticism of Daniel up until really the last 100 or so years. And the critics of Daniel argued that this was an error, that the Medo-Persian Empire didn't follow the downfall of Babylon. But in fact, there's been more recent discoveries that have again proven beyond any doubt that the second empire was that of the Medes and the Persians. Now, the counterpart in chapter 2 of this beast, this bear here, is the arms and chest of silver, which again lead to being identified as Medo-Persia. We need to consider that the use of the bear as symbolism is seldom found anywhere else in Tanakh. And that gives this emphasis here in Daniel. The meaning here to focus on the fact that this second empire would be powerful like a bear gives emphasis, since it's really the only mention of the bear. Let's look in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 17 through 19. It says, I will stir up against them, talking Babylon, the Medes who cannot be tempted by silver or bought off by gold. Their bows will tear young men to pieces. They will have no pity on the fruit of their womb. Their eye will not spare children. Thus Bavel, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Kasdim, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when overthrown by God. It's going to be totally obliterated. It's going to cease to exist as a independent kingdom. It won't be burned to the ground, destroyed physically like that, but its existence as a kingdom will no longer be in existence, except for a little something we're going to run into a little later as we work our way through Scripture. The Medo-Persian army was huge for its size. The Medo-Persian Empire grew to be much larger than the Babylonian Empire had been. The bear, the symbol, had one side raised up higher than the other, and the Medo-Persian Empire was a partnership, an alliance between the Medes and the Persians, but it's a historical fact that the Persians ultimately gained control over the Medes in this partnership and made them subject to themselves. The three ribs in the mouth of the bear may refer to Media and Persia and Babylon as the three major components of this empire, which had enlarged itself by taking over the Babylonian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire replaced Babylon on the evening of October 13th, 539 BCE. You'll remember from Daniel chapter 5, the handwriting on the wall. That's when this occurred. The Medo-Persian Empire then continued over 200 years until it was toppled by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. And then we have the third beast, Daniel 7:6. After this I looked, and there was another one, like a leopard with 4 birds' wings on its sides. And the animal also had 4 heads and was given power to rule. The description of the third beast is again different from those that preceded it. It was like a leopard, having 4 wings on its sides and having 4 heads. And this beast is commonly identified as the empire of the Greeks, the empire of Alexander the Great. And the only direct comment on this beast is that it was given dominion. It was given the power to rule. Now, the leopard is not as grand and majestic as the lion. Like the belly of bronze was less grand than the chest of silver on the statue of Daniel chapter 2. Again, we have a comparison. We have the belly of thighs of bronze, we have the leopard, and this is speaking of the Greek Empire, which includes the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and we'll do a little on that in just a minute. Now, these 4 heads are really the point of interest to us. They indicate that this empire would ultimately split, that it would have 4 governmental divisions, each division having its own head or its own king. The swiftness of Alexander the Great's army was like that of a leopard. It charged. History of Alexander the Great corresponds exactly with what's being described for us here. Lightning swiftness of his conquests were without precedent in the ancient world. An apt description of the image of speed embodied in the leopard and the 4 wings on its back. Alexander had the fastest moving army. In 8 years, the Greeks marched and conquered more than 11,000 miles of territory. That's a huge chunk of real estate. On June 13th, 323, Alexander the Great died at the age of 32. And after his death, the kingdom was divided into 4 parts by his 4 leading generals, led by his 4 leading generals. That's the 4 heads of the leopard that we see. 2 of these will become very important to us, as we'll see a little later in the study. But for now, let's go to the 4th empire in Daniel chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. After this I looked, and in the night visions there before me was a 4th animal, dreadful, horrible, extremely strong, with great iron teeth that devoured, crushed, stamped its feet on what was left. It was different from all the other animals that had gone before it, and it had, listen to this, 10 horns. That's important. Retain 10 horns. Next. While I was considering the horns, another horn sprung up among them, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. In this horn were eyes like human eyes, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. Before we go any further, let me tell you that is the first description of the false Messiah, of what the church calls the Antichrist, given to us in Scripture. I want to give you a little commentary here. The other 3 beasts were all couched in a language of things that are familiar to humans, things out of creation, if you will, modified a little, but still recognizable by man. A lion, a bear, a leopard, eagle's wings, bird's wings, those sorts of things. Animals are described there, the lion, the bear, the leopard were certainly ferocious, would have no conscience towards having the opportunity to kill something. These animals were strong. They could impose their will on those that they would conquer. But then there's this 4th beast. This beast is not defined in any of those kind of terms. It gets beyond being described as something that is recognizable by man. There's a certain different spiritual quality about this 4th beast, this 4th empire. Something that's not in the other ones. This beast is defined with human terms, but not on any terms of the world that we live in. This critter is different from anything that we can actually visualize in our own minds. It's not of the created world that we live in. And there appears to be a spiritual quality here permeating this beast that did not permeate the others. The 4th beast is identified by most conservative scholars as starting with the Roman Empire. I'm going to make a comment on my thoughts about this at the end of this evening's lesson. But the beginning of the dominion of Rome was in 241 BCE, and it started with the conquest of Sicily. From there, in fairly short order, the Mediterranean Sea really became just a Roman lake. By the beginning of the 2nd century in BCE, Spain had been conquered, then Carthage at the Battle of Zama in North Africa in 202 BCE. The area north of Italy was subjected, then Rome moved eastward, conquering Macedonia, Greece, and Asia Minor. In 65 BCE, the Roman general Pompey took Jerusalem after destroying the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, which was Syria, that being one of those four heads of the leopard that had managed to hang on to power just that long. That was the end of the Greeks as far as a ruling group. In the following decades, Rome expanded its control to England, to France, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany west of the Rhine. Roman Empire continued to grow steadily for 4 centuries, 400 years. It's fascinating to study. It reached its peak about 117 to 120 Common Era. And it went on pretty well unchanged for a while, and then decline began to set in. The decline of the Roman Empire was very slow, really beginning someplace about the 3rd century of the Common Era. Romans were, as I say, slow in their decline. They left England in 407. They suffered the sacking of Rome itself in 410. By 476, though, the western division of the Roman Empire was dead. It was essentially gone. There was no physical Roman rule. However, there was a spiritual rule that was taking place at that same time that controlled. Interestingly enough, it was not until 1453 that the eastern division of the Roman Empire fell apart. At some place in here, we're going to take you through a whole bunch of divisions from the beginning of Rome all the way down through until the false Messiah appears. 1453 was when the eastern division of the Roman Empire fell, disappeared from Roman rule. That's just 39 years before Columbus discovered America. The fourth beast is, for all practical purposes, almost beyond description. But there is an implied spiritual component in this description that we're being given. It's a fascinating spectacle. Daniel fixes his eyes on this vision that we're being given. The beast is described as dreadful, horrible, extremely strong. With great iron teeth, it devoured, crushed, stomped its feet on what was left, and it had 10 horns. It had 10 horns. Not like the other beasts. It had great iron teeth, which takes it out of the realm of any known animal. As Daniel watched, the beast was seen to devour and break into pieces and stomp the residue of all the preceding kingdoms. I'm harping on this. They were different. There was no beast like this before. Alexander the Great had really rapid troop movements, but rarely crushed people that he conquered. The Romans were ruthless in their destruction of civilizations and peoples, killing captives by the thousands, selling captives into slavery by the hundreds of thousands. They would take an area, and those too young to be sold as slaves would be killed. Those too old or infirm to be sold into slavery would be killed. We couldn't make money off of them. Rome could never get enough conquest because that was the way they were financing the building of their empire. Rivals like Carthage would be broken as much as anything just because they were there and a threat. The saying of Julius Caesar, "We came, we saw, we conquered." Rome had no interest in raising conquered nations to any kind of high levels of development. Their concept was that all nations be crushed and stomped underfoot. But this Roman Empire was just the start of this fourth animal description. This description leaps ahead to today, right here in this passage. Verses 7 and 8 talks about Rome. And then all of a sudden here in verse and 10 horns, and all of a sudden here there's a little horn. Think about this. Rome happened 2,000 years ago. The 10 horns are in place right now. There's 10 kingdoms in the world, and the little horn is yet to pop his head up. But he's coming. 2 verses right there in the middle of Daniel take us from point A to point Z. To me, that's fantastic. Again, the 8th verse tells us that Daniel looked intently at this 4th division. As he considered it, he saw another horn, a little horn emerging from the head of the beast, which had 10 horns. Now that beast is the 4th empire of man. The 10 horns, really, we will see as we progress through this, is this empire moved forward into our age where the world has divided itself into 10 economic regions. European Union, African Union, South American Union, NAFTA. You can continue to name them. They're laid out. The Club of Rome started this way back in the late middle of the 20th century. Now, there's a little horn seen emerging from the head of the beast, which had 10 horns, and in the process, this little horn uproots 3 of the horns that were in place. In other words, he gains control of 3 of the 10 districts of the world, and by that he can control the rest of the world. Watch the description of the little horn. See, because this introduces the false Messiah that's coming. It has eyes like a man. It has mouth that spoke arrogantly. We're going to reserve more commentary on this till we get to verses 23 and 24. But one thing, into this otherwise incredibly horrible beast, a human factor, not a humane factor, but a human factor is introduced. The reasonable conclusion is that the 10 horns represent 10 kings and their kingdoms. Also that the little horn is a man, and the eyes and mouth giving human characteristics. Then, in Daniel's vision, the scene shifts. He's been dealing right up until now with stuff purely going on the earth. But simultaneously, there's stuff going on in the heavens, right? So here, right in the middle of this, Daniel's vision scene changes. Daniel 7, 9, and 10. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient One took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair on his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames with wheels burning fire. The stream of fire flowed from his presence. Thousands and thousands ministered to him. Millions and millions stood before him. Then the court was convened, and the books were opened. What a shift. We've moved from a corrupt earth being taken over by someone who is working for Satan, determined to destroy it for Satan's sake, into the heavens with what's going on with God. The scene shifts from the beast and the 4th world empire to a vision of heaven. In verses 9 through 14, we're looking at 9 and 10 now. Major factors are present. 9 and 10 is a scene in heaven at the time of the final judgment on the nations, which will be Revelation 19. And in verses 11, 12, we'll get there in a minute, the little horn representing the last ruler of the time of the Gentiles is destroyed with his empire. In verses 13 and 14, that's where we'll pick up next week, the kingdom of the Son of Man is soon coming in the clouds of heaven, bringing in the fifth and final kingdom, thereby ending man's dominion over the earth. All this in Daniel chapter 7, which is why it's taken us 2 weeks to work our way through this. But here in verse 9, Daniel sees thrones, plural thrones in heaven. Pay attention to this if you want to be a serious witness in the Jewish community. There are thrones, plural, and the Ancient One comes in and takes his seat on one of them. Hello, that leaves an empty one sitting there. Ask the question, who else is going to be seated there? Plural has to mean 2 thrones at least. In its effort to eradicate the possibility that Yeshua is Messiah, the rabbinic community totally ignores this scripture. It's never taught in the Jewish community. The Ancient One takes his seat. If you were to look in the King James Version, the translation would say the thrones were cast down. That leaves the wrong taste in my mouth. It gives the wrong impression. It's an ancient way of saying that they were put in place. However, Stern has a better translation here, that the thrones were set in place. They were established. This is the establishment, not the destruction, of the judgment thrones in heaven that's being talked about right here in this verse. The Ancient One is, of course, God, who, as distinct from his Son, the Messiah, who's going to be introduced in verse 13 coming up pretty quick next week, he's going to be the Son of Man. The expression of the Ancient One is only used of God in this chapter, where the title is repeated in verses 13 and again in verse 22, as we'll find out next week. The description of the hair like pure wool and white as snow clothing signifies purity and righteousness. Go to Isaiah 1:18, please. Come now, says Adonai, let's talk this over together. If your sins are like scarlet, they'll be white as snow. Even if they're red as crimson, they will be like wool. Isn't that pretty interesting that God is able to give his purity and his righteousness to people, and what he wants us to do is sit down and talk together about it. This Ancient One is sitting on his throne, and he's described in this manner: clothes whiter than snow, hair like pure wool. This is a judge untainted by corruption. His judgments are absolutely just. God referred to here as the Ancient One indicates he's existed throughout the entire course of history. The Ancient One, he's existed throughout the entire course of history as an eyewitness to all the deeds of human beings and their kingdoms. Something to think about. Today, science is doing DNA. DNA, they're doing DNA on dinosaur eggs. They're doing DNA on mummies. Remember, they found a guy frozen in an ice thing in a glacier a few years ago. They're doing DNA tests on him, trying to find out about the test subjects. They're not going to find out anything that God doesn't already know, because the Ancient One was there. He knew every minute detail about them. He eyewitnessed everything. Just the thing about the mummy. The Ancient One saw the mummy's birth, watched him grow up, watched him play, watched him work, watched him perhaps raise a family, watched him die. See, the Ancient One knows every detail. If you sneezed in 2007, he saw it happen. He knows every detail. This is a judge that does not have to rely on second-hand testimony. Whatever he judges, he has seen. Therefore, his judgments are accurate. And the major characteristic of the throne the Ancient One sits on is that it was a burning flame. It is a burning flame. If you have a translation that says like a burning flame, like is not in the original Aramaic. That throne is a burning flame with wheels that are also burning. This fits a parallel description given in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 13 through 21. That's Ezekiel 1, 13 through 21. It also is a description of the chariot that picked up Elijah. Remember Elijah getting picked up? 2 Kings 2:11. Now, that Messiah as the Son of Man should have the same glory as the Ancient of Days is not really a contradiction. Boy, have I gotten into debates over that. The glory is the same, even though Daniel gives a distinction between their persons. We'll see the Ancient One and we'll see the Messiah, the Son of Man, and they're distinct, but their glory is the same. Their glory is the same. I'm going to refer you for that to Yochanan, John's Gospel, chapter 17, verses 4 and 5. This is Yeshua speaking, I glorified you on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do. Now, Father, glorify me alongside yourself. Give me the same glory I had with you, the same glory I had with you, the same glory I had with you before the world existed. 2 thrones. Who's going to be sitting on the second throne? Those thrones were fire, and there was a river of fire flowing from beneath them. Fire represents the glory of God, and the glory of God always signifies the special presence of God, especially with regard to judgment. In the scene of the blazing glory, innumerable saints and angels are observing ministry to God. It's interesting that hundreds of years later, Yochanan in the book of the Revelation sees this same Revelation 5, 11, and 12. Please. Then I looked and I heard the sound of vast numbers of angels, thousands and thousands, millions and millions. They were all around the throne, the living beings and the elders, and they shouted out, Worthy is the Lamb to receive power, riches, wisdom, strength, honor, and glory and praise. In Daniel's vision, these angels were prepared to execute the sentence of judgment which God would pronounce. It tells us that. We're going to have to listen to this one twice, aren't we? They were ministering before God. They were there ministering before God, doing his bidding. Then in the presence of God in all his glory, the books are opened. The books are opened and the judgment is set, and the final hour of decision as far as the nations are concerned is going to be carried out. In Revelation 20:12, it is recorded that God keeps a record of human deeds. Listen, let me tell you, there are all kinds of books of records of the deeds of humanity out there. But we're talking here of a set of books in regards to the acts and deeds of the nations over human history. Just think about this. The 20th century was the bloodiest century in existence in all of human history. All of human history. So much for man moving to any kind of a higher evolution. The Nazi regime, there's books for that. Stalin and what he did, there's books for that. What went on in China and the millions that were killed there, Cambodia, Rwanda, all over the face of the earth, God has recorded all of that. He has it. They don't realize it, but God is keeping books on all of this. All of this. And these books, according to what we've just looked at in Daniel, are going to be opened. Are going to be opened. It appears in the following verses that we're going to look at, 11 and 12, that they declare that the little horn and the 4 beasts/empires are to be taken and judged. The books here contain the deeds of the false Messiah and the 4 great Gentile kingdoms of the world, and actually I believe all the kingdoms of the world that ever existed, because this is the end of the times of the Gentiles that started in the latter part of the 6th century and will continue until our Messiah serves out, or returns to serve out his 1,000 years. We're still living in the times of the Gentiles. Daniel 7, 11 and 12. I kept watching. Then because of the arrogant words which the horn was speaking, I watched as the animal was killed. Its body was destroyed and was given over to be burned up completely. As for other animals, their rulership was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a time and a season. Scene shifts again, this time back to earth, as Daniel listens to the boastful words uttered by the little horn. I'm going to throw a whole bunch of facts at you and help break it down with detail next week. Because of these boastful words of the little horn, Daniel saw that the beast, the kingdom, the animal, however you want to describe it, that fourth empire of man was destroyed. Its body destroyed, and it was given over to burning flame. God says he's going to judge with fire. We're going to get to that. There's no doubt that this judgment is going to be swift, not prolonged over a period of time. Revelation 19:20 appears to be a parallel passage with this verse. Verse 12 has been found to be difficult because of liberal critics. The problem is how the other kingdoms have their lives prolonged even though their dominion is taken away. We're going to see here, you see, the other animals, the other kingdoms, their rulership was taken along, but their lives were prolonged for a time and a season, even after that fourth kingdom is in the process of being totally disintegrated, right up till Messiah returns and rules. Those pieces of those first three are going to be there. They're not totally absorbed, not totally destroyed, but in fact absorbed into the next world kingdom that conquered them. They continue to exist as part of a new expression of Gentile world domination, part of this fourth empire, but they're going to live even beyond it. Think about it. When Rome conquered Greece, how much of the Greek culture was absorbed into the Roman culture? So there isn't a complete destruction and cutoff from the past. There's that absorption. In a sense, the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks would continue to live for the complete period of time. None of the peoples of those empires were destroyed. Now, since Babylon and the Medo-Persians and the Greeks continue to exist as part of the Roman Empire, the judgment of the Roman Empire then will end up being their judgment as well, ultimately, because they're all going to collapse together. Remember, and I know this has gotten a little confusing because I've thrown too much. Remember these feet of clay? When those are destroyed, this whole thing from Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome starting in all collapse at the same time. That's the picture for us. That's the picture for us. The end of this fourth beast is going to be dramatic. It's going to be cataclysmic. It's going to be final. But I'm going to stop here because the next verse is going to introduce the Messiah, and I don't want to start on that tonight with only 2 minutes left. Besides, I promised to comment on the Roman Empire at the end of this evening's session. I believe that the Roman Empire represents just the beginning of the fourth beast. The Roman Empire is not going to be revived because the whole world at this point is going to have been morphed into this undefinable, unexplainable fourth empire. Remember, it's emphasized that this fourth empire is a beast that's not like any others. And we're just going to deal with the western part of the empire. You can do much the same, though, with the East. After the Western Empire had folded, Europe was held in check mainly by threat of excommunication of the rulers of various countries by the Roman Church. If they didn't conform, those leaders would be taken out. Beginning with the crowning of Charlemagne, there was a continuing succession of rulers that included Napoleon, Bismarck, Hitler, each of whom set out in his own way with varying amounts of success to recreate the old empire. Since Hitler was in place, the attempt has been economic. We've created economic divisions in the world. The European Union is the first of those. But the thing that Rome invented was imperialism. Imperialism. And this has now gone worldwide as well. The Fourth Empire didn't hibernate when Rome finally collapsed. In my opinion, it continued on as a chameleon, constantly changing its form, much like Alexander's empire continued with a new form, 4 heads instead of 1. I don't think Rome needs to be revived. The EU will be one of 10 kingdoms, which are now well in place, and we'll look at that really very much in depth in 2 or 3 weeks. What I want us to remember is we're not trying to teach you how it will happen. That's not my purpose. Not teach you how it will happen, but prepare you to recognize it when it happens. And it's going on. Continually has been since that first empire was formed by God. See you next week. Hugs and out.